Okay, class, welcome. Today our podcast lecture topic is going to be the Russian Revolution, and it kind of keys together with that previous lecture we finished, which was World War I, because the Russian Revolution, the Communist Revolution of Russia, is born out of the events of World War I. So just, we can do a little brief recap. Russia entered World War I on the side of France and England. By far, they suffered the most casualties and the most disruption of their economic system because of World War I. So basically, Russia had always kind of went into World War I being somewhat feared because of their size and of their massive population. However, as is often the case, that size and that massive population was predominantly unruly and poorly trained for military combat. And so basically, Russia had always been, if you take a look at the lecture about Peter the Great, Russia had always been kind of taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back in the modern era. They were a country that was both European and Asian, and because they stretched across the entire northern portion of the European world and Asian world. And that size and that disruption of population, very thinly distributed throughout the country, made managing the country and having a productive economy extremely difficult. Now, one of the other problems, which we've kind of hinted at, was the failure of Russia's economy to be able to work year long. And what we're talking about there is the absence of what we call a warm water port. Russia could only ship goods out of its northern ports about 4 to 5 months out of the year. And because of that, that also limited the growth of the Russian economy. And that's why, especially in the 1800s and early 1900s, the Russians were very, very dedicated to finding what we call a warm water port. Now, long story short, we talked about World War I. We talked about the battles. We didn't really talk a whole lot about Russia's exit of the war. Basically, Russia went into the war as probably the most absolute monarchy of Europe that was left. They had successfully resisted that liberal movement of constitutionalism. So much so, in fact, that by the time we reached 1910, Russia was still working with a predominantly autocratic or absolute ruler, with an advisory council of elite nobles, and with the bulk of the population being locked out of political expression or political power. And that would come to basically unravel during the during the Great War, or during World War I. Basically what happened is, as the war continued to amp up and get more intense for the Russians, what began to happen is the Russian economy began to stumble, and Russian harvests began to fail. And because of that, that limited the amount of food production in Russia. And in order to keep the soldiers fed, the Russian government began to basically ration, and then eventually we had outbreaks of famine within mainland Russia, as most of their resources were going to keep the army in the field against the Germans. Now, that issue of resource compounded by poor leadership. The Tsar at the time, the leader, the Tsar, was a guy named Nicholas II Romanov. And he had basically grown up and lived an extremely privileged life and was ill-equipped to basically deal with the pressures and the problems of commanding the Russian government during World War I. The problems for the Romanov dynasty under Nicholas II start prior to the war, specifically in the case of one of his most trusted advisors, who was a monk by the name of Rasputin. Rasputin had basically been a cleric of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and at the same time he was also a medical physician, because at that point in time in Russia, hospitals were still manned by the Orthodox Church. Tsar Nicholas II's son, Alexander, basically had several different conditions one being hemophilia, which is a failure of your blood to clot when you get a cut, but he also suffered from epilepsy. And what happened over time is Rasputin found a way into the royal family through becoming the royal physician of Alexander. It was said that he could help Alexander calm these epileptic seizures. And using that influence, Rasputin soon became one of the most powerful men in Russia. Now the problem was that he was extremely disliked, he was extremely corrupt, and at the end of his life he was basically a tyrant, or basically trying to rule Russia in his own name. People hated him so much, in fact, that at one time, at the end of his life, he was invited to a dinner where he was poisoned, he was then shot, he was castrated, hung, and then dumped in the river just to make sure he was dead, because the Russian people, the Russian nobles, actually believed that he might have supernatural powers. Now, while that was the fate of Rasputin, the big problem for for Nicholas II, was that since he was part of the royal family entourage, all of the negative publicity, all the corruptive aspects of Rasputin were basically seen as being Tsar Nicholas's problems too. And then in the aftermath of Rasputin's death, we have the start of the Great War, World War I, and immediately when the Russians got involved, the casualty rates soared, and the Russian people began to question their leader, Nicholas, about Russia staying in the war. To make matters worse, Nicholas at one point thought it would be better if he personally directed the military plans, which was an ultimate disaster, which resulted in that famous loss of 1 million men in a single battle. And the reason why that battle was so terrible was that when the fighting began to get close to him, he basically left. He retreated by himself, which demoralized the Russian forces and forced a full retreat, which basically opened up their backs to German firepower. Long story short, the pressures of the war, the inability of the Russians to feed the Russian soldiers, continued to mount. And then basically what happened was we have the beginnings of several different groups that were starting to basically protest the Russian government and protest Russia's involvement in World War I. To make matters worse, one of these groups was a communist group who was led by a guy by the name of Vladimir Lenin. And this is rather kind of a sneaky part of the war. Lenin had been basically exiled from Russia prior to 1910. He was living in exile when World War I started. And what the Germans did, the German forces actually found they found Lenin, they gave him money and weaponry, and they secretly smuggled him back into Russia to help organize protests, communist protests against the government. By 1917, these protests, whether they be communist, socialist, or just anybody in general, they got to be so great that in 1917, Nicholas II quit. He left the government, he abdicated the throne, thinking that it would prove to the Russian people how much they needed him, and that he would basically be begged back to his job. Now, that was a serious mistake, because after he left, the Russian people pushed right ahead and began to create a provisional government. It's called the Provisional Government, the Social Provisional Government of Russia. And the leader was a guy by the name of Kerensky. And Kerensky was a socialist, bringing together socialist groups, communist groups, the Mensheviks, who were the peaceful communists, and the Bolsheviks, who were led by Lenin, as well as the nobility that were looking to end the war. However, Kerensky's government made the decision to stay in the war, the casualties continued, and the domestic disturbance, basically the people, grew more and more tired of being in World War I. Now, what happened behind the scenes is Lenin, who wanted to take power for himself in a communist revolution, began to organize the communists, the Bolshevik Party, and he began to outfit them with weapons in anticipation of starting a revolution. We have the so-called, if you look on the outline, we have the so-called protests in Leningrad, and we have, in St. Petersburg, and we have protests around Russia. In the next provisional election in late 1917, the Russians, basically the Bolsheviks, tried to amass more seats. Their platform for election was peace, bread, and land, in which they promised the Russian people that they would redistribute land, which is kind of odd because if they're communists, they want to get rid of private property. But the first step that they argued for was taking the land from the rich and giving it to the poor as their own personal property, which seems like something in opposition to the communist ideal. The second thing they ordered was bread. They would stop supporting the army. They would pull the troops out of the war and basically feed the people of Russia. And last but not least, as I said, peace. They would exit the war. This was a very powerful message, and the Bolsheviks won a lot of seats, but they did not win enough seats to take over. And so basically, in the aftermath of not winning the election completely, Lenin and the Bolsheviks organized a coup, or basically they organized a government takeover. They tried it in, late summer. It failed. They tried it again in October, and that's what's called Red October. They tried it again in October, and it was fairly successful. So in the aftermath of the Bolshevik Civil War, with them taking control of the royal family and then exterminating the royal family, that war continued to drag on. As I said, from basically 1918 is when they have the assassination of the Romanov family, through 1922. And basically what happened over the course of this war is that the Bolsheviks, even though they were an extremely small party in terms of population, they were able to manipulate and control the Russian people's dissatisfaction with World War I and their dissatisfaction with the, quote, established government of the Romanov dynasty, to kind of pull that together to get basic control of the urban centers. Now, this didn't happen in a vacuum, though. When World War I ended, one of the reasons why the Russians were not allowed to participate in the Treaty of Versailles, as I mentioned, was because of their civil war. And this was a civil war that was fought, as I said, primarily between the Bolsheviks on one side and the socialists and the Mensheviks and the nobles on the other side. Now, the European powers, who were decimated by World War I, they were fairly they were fairly incapable of helping out. But the American war effort, we did help by supplying weaponry and materials that we had sent over to the European war effort during World War I. We began to support the socialists and the Menshevik communists, who were more traditional communists, versus this radical Bolshevik party. And yet, even despite all these resources and help, eventually in 1922, the Bolsheviks achieved control of the urban centers of Russia and were able to basically cement their power structure. And at that point, the first, quote, communist revolution in European or / world history had been successful. We had an attempt of a communist government in Paris in 1848, in the so-called Communist Revolution of Paris in 1848, but it had failed miserably. But by 1922, we have a successful communist revolution. Now, I do want to reiterate, though, it was not a, quote, true communist revolution, as what the Mensheviks argued. It's because according to Karl Marx, the father of communism, the guy who created the idea, communism could not be caused in the sense that you could not make a communist revolution occur. Karl Marx argued that it was inevitable, that it had to happen at a certain point in human history, and that if you tried to make it happen, it would be an artificial revolution. And so basically what happened is Vladimir Lenin, his second in command, Leon Trotsky, and his third in command, Joseph Stalin, had effected this revolution. They had organized the Bolshevik and had outfitted them with weapons and had manipulated the public of Russia to accepting this finality, if you will, of the Russian Revolution. But unfortunately for Vladimir Lenin, it was a very short-lived victory, because by 1924, interesting enough, Lenin suffered a stroke. And that stroke left him paralyzed and unable to communicate in any fashion with his subordinates, being Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin. And it's really at this point in 1924 that the Communist Revolution, which had started out on this kind of it was a strict path, but which had talked about partial land ownership and all of those materials, that began to shift and change in the aftermath of Vladimir Lenin's stroke and subsequent death. What happened in 1924 is there began a power struggle between Leon Trotsky, who was the head of the Red Army, and Joseph Stalin, who was basically the primary motivator and had basically accumulated blackmail information on all the major members of the Communist Party. Now this fight that broke out in 24 lasted for a few months and eventually resulted in Joseph Stalin becoming the head of the Communist Party. Leon Trotsky was exiled. Later he was assassinated by a follower of Stalin. He was tracked down in the mountains of the Mexican mountains in Central America, and basically somebody buried an ice pick in his head to kill him after basically gaining access to his cabin. Stalin took over, and it was really Stalin who kind of ushered in the main phase of the communization of Russia. And that's a topic that we're going to talk about when we talk about the so-called interwar years. From 1919 until 1939, we have about a 20-year period that we call the interwar years, in which a lot happened to kind of create the situation that produced World War II. So we'll pick that topic up next. Thank you.